Have you ever wondered why the moment you begin to see reality as it truly is, everything around you starts to shift, sometimes in alarming ways? There is a silent danger in facing what the crowd refuses to confront, a hidden cost in awakening to truths most people spend their entire lives avoiding. When you peel back the layers of collective denial, you're no longer participating in the comfortable illusions everyone else calls normal life. Instead, you become the one who sees too much, feels too deeply, and understands what others instinctively turn away from. And that awareness changes everything. The crowd survives through shared blindness. They cling to familiar narratives, repeat inherited beliefs, and protect their routines as if their safety depends on never questioning them. But when you awaken, when you finally notice the cracks in the collective story, you disturb the entire structure simply by existing. You walk into a room and sense the tension no one names. You hear the dishonesty woven into casual conversations. You notice the fear behind people's confidence. Suddenly, reality feels louder, sharper, impossible to mute, and once you see it, there is no way back to ignorance. But this clarity does not come without consequences. The more you perceive, the more isolated you may feel, not because you withdrew, but because others instinctively pull away from what threatens their fragile sense of stability. Your presence becomes a mirror they don't want to look into. You become the one who questions the script they desperately want to continue performing. And the moment you start living outside the collective illusion, you begin walking a path few are prepared to follow. So let me ask you something before we continue. Have you ever felt this shift happening inside you? If these words resonate, stay with me, because what you're about to understand might change the way you see your own awakening. And before we move on, tell me in the comments what part of this experience you've already lived. Make sure to like this video and check if you're subscribed, because understanding this journey deeply matters for your own inner clarity, and we're just getting started. Once you begin to see what others avoid, something subtle but irreversible starts to unfold within you. It is as if your perception sharpens by itself, revealing layers of meaning beneath the surface of ordinary life. The crowd moves through the world, guided by assumptions they never question, reacting to life rather than actually perceiving it. But your awareness starts scanning deeper, noticing patterns in human behavior, contradictions in social expectations, and the psychological games people play without realizing they are playing them. This shift is not dramatic. It is quiet, internal, almost invisible from the outside. Yet inside, everything is rearranging. You begin to realize that most people are not interacting with reality. They are interacting with their beliefs about reality. They defend opinions they never examined, follow routines that numb them, and cling to identities built on stories they inherited rather than chose. And while they remain inside this comfortable fog, you start stepping outside it, watching how these invisible mechanisms shape every conversation, every reaction, every conflict. You see how fear dictates choices, how avoidance shapes relationships, how denial becomes a form of survival. This heightened perception can feel like suddenly being the only person who hears a sound no one else notices. At first, you question yourself. You wonder if you are exaggerating, if you are reading too deeply into things, if maybe you should ignore what you are seeing. But the truth keeps resurfacing with greater clarity. You notice when someone speaks but their body betrays them. You sense when people are hiding emotions beneath rehearsed smiles. You detect the unspoken tension in a room long before anyone acknowledges it. And slowly you understand that your mind is no longer operating on the same layer as the collective. It is not that you want to separate yourself. It is that the more you perceive, the harder it becomes to participate in what others still believe. Their conversations feel scripted, their priorities feel borrowed, their sense of urgency feels misplaced. You're not judging them. You're simply witnessing the difference between living awake and living asleep. And with every new insight, that inner distance quietly expands, not by choice, but because awareness reshapes your entire relationship with the world around you. As your awareness deepens, you begin to notice a pattern in how the world reacts to truth. It is not overt, Not necessarily hostile at first, but subtle, persistent, and disarming. The collective instinctively resists anything that disrupts the comforting illusions they rely upon. And once you see the mechanisms at play, it becomes impossible to ignore them. The polite smiles, the casual reassurances, the repeated refrains of "everything is fine," they no longer feel genuine. You understand that people are performing roles they have internalized, acting out scripts that were never consciously chosen, and the entire theater continues unnoticed by those who believe they are awake. This realization can feel disorienting. You start to question familiar relationships, routines, and even your place within social structures. You notice contradictions and hypocrisies that were previously invisible. Conversations that once seemed ordinary now reveal hidden tensions, unspoken judgments, and subtle manipulations. The world that once felt cohesive now appears layered with denial, avoidance, and collective self-deception. Your mind, trained to perceive and analyze, begins mapping these patterns with precision, and it becomes increasingly clear that participating in the crowd's illusion is no longer sustainable. Yet this clarity is not a gift without its challenges. With heightened perception comes the burden of understanding the disparity between what is seen and what is accepted. You feel the subtle weight of knowing truths that others do not want to confront. The invisible currents of fear, denial, and pretense become almost tangible. You recognize how societal norms, cultural expectations, and inherited beliefs shape behavior, constraining authenticity and suppressing insight. And as you observe, a quiet responsibility emerges, not to correct others, but to navigate a world that is increasingly alien to your newly awakened perception. This stage is marked by a strange duality. You are deeply connected to reality, yet increasingly isolated from the collective experience. Your awareness is expanding while the comfort of conformity fades. You witness the gaps between appearances and reality, between what is spoken and what is felt. And in this tension, you begin to cultivate discernment, learning to differentiate between what deserves your attention and what belongs to the unconscious patterns of others. Your perception sharpens, your understanding grows, and the journey becomes less about what you can change externally and more about how you sustain clarity internally without being consumed by the contradictions around you. Once you begin to consistently see what the crowd avoids, the resistance from the external world becomes unavoidable. People may not openly confront you, but subtle tensions emerge. Colleagues, friends, even family members start to act differently around you. Their casual remarks carry hidden sharpness, their laughter feels brittle, their gestures hesitant. Your clarity mirrors truths they are unwilling to face, and simply by existing in awareness, you trigger discomfort in those who cling to collective illusions. You notice how ordinary interactions are layered with avoidance, how small contradictions provoke silent defensiveness, and how the very act of observing can feel like a disruption. At first, this subtle resistance can feel confusing. You may question your own perceptions, wondering if you are overreacting or misreading the signals, but the patterns repeat. Each time you speak with honesty, each time you point out something that others have long ignored, you feel the pushback. Not loud, not accusatory, but persistent, an undercurrent of unease that follows your presence. The more clearly you see, the more invisible friction accumulates. You realize that the world prefers compliant perception, the kind that nods without examining, agrees without questioning, and embraces comfort over truth. This is where the challenge intensifies, understanding that the pushback is not personal, but systemic. It is the natural response of a collective consciousness unprepared for awakening. And yet, it is also an invitation to test your resilience, to measure your inner stability, and to refine your capacity for discernment. You begin to navigate interactions with a careful balance, speaking truth without aggression, observing without being drawn into futile arguments, and maintaining your own clarity without succumbing to the discomfort others project onto you. So I want to ask you, have you noticed these subtle reactions around you? Have you experienced the tension that arises when your perception disrupts the usual harmony of social interactions? Share your experience in the comments below, because understanding this dynamic is crucial for anyone walking the path of awareness. Your insight can help others recognize patterns they might have overlooked, and discussing it allows the community of awakened individuals to grow stronger. Let me know what has surprised you most, and reflect on the ways awareness changes your engagement with the world. As you continue down the path of seeing what most people avoid, the weight of isolation begins to settle in. It is not always a visible loneliness, not the kind that can be measured by empty rooms or silent phones. Rather, it is a subtle, pervasive separation from the collective consciousness. You start noticing that conversations no longer feel satisfying, that casual social interactions leave a hollow echo, and that the shared narratives of others seem increasingly shallow or disconnected from reality. This is the quiet solitude of the awakened mind, a space where perception has outpaced the understanding of those around you. In this solitude, every interaction becomes a measure of alignment or misalignment with your own emerging awareness. You begin to detect the difference between presence and performance, between authentic engagement and habitual compliance. Where once you could participate in social rituals without thought, now each gesture, each word, carries a weight of awareness. You see not only what is said, but also what is left unsaid. You notice the subtle agreements to ignore reality, the unspoken compacts to maintain comfort at the expense of truth. And, slowly, this clarity begins to shape your social landscape. This stage often brings profound insight into your own boundaries. You realize that you can no longer fully inhabit environments that demand constant compromise of perception. You feel compelled to step back, to choose interactions that honor both your awareness and your energy. Yet even as you withdraw, you notice the paradox. In stepping away from collective illusions, you begin to experience a truer form of connection. You encounter moments of resonance with those who are awake, however quietly, and you begin to understand that your solitude is not emptiness, but a recalibration, a preparation for engagement on a different frequency. With every step, your discernment deepens. You begin to see which relationships nourish understanding and which reinforce unconscious patterns. The awareness of the disparity between your perception and the collective consciousness sharpens your judgment and refines your choices. You learn that isolation is not a punishment. It is a natural consequence of awakening. And within this isolation, you cultivate resilience, clarity, and a quiet confidence in your own perception, laying the foundation for navigating a world that is largely asleep while remaining fully present and awake within it. At this point, the awakening mind begins to recognize the fragility of the collective agreement that shapes everyday life. You notice that most people are unconsciously bound to patterns that dictate thought, emotion, and behavior, and that any deviation from these patterns is met with subtle resistance or overt confusion. The realization is profound. The world around you functions as a carefully orchestrated illusion, a shared performance designed to maintain stability and predictability. And as you see through this, your own relationship to the world begins to shift. You begin to understand that stepping outside the familiar rhythms of collective thought is both necessary and inevitable. You are no longer satisfied with the superficial exchanges, the shallow validations, the stories people tell themselves to justify conformity. Instead, your attention turns inward, toward discerning which aspects of your own consciousness are authentic and which have been unconsciously absorbed from the surrounding environment. You find yourself questioning long-held assumptions, cultural norms, and inherited beliefs, seeking clarity in the midst of the noise. This process brings with it a sense of liberation, but also a heightened responsibility. Every choice becomes a measure of alignment with truth rather than social expectation. You learn to navigate interactions with a new awareness, recognizing when to engage and when to observe silently, when to speak and when to hold space without interference. Your perception extends beyond the obvious, allowing you to identify subtle patterns of influence, control, and unconscious projection that others fail to notice. And yet there is a paradox at work. The more clearly you perceive, the more you understand the futility of trying to force change in those who are not ready. Awareness does not compel transformation. It only illuminates what is already present. You learn to hold this clarity lightly, to observe without judgment, and to maintain a conscious distance from the emotional currents of others. In doing so, you preserve your energy, safeguard your boundaries, and cultivate a stable center from which genuine engagement can arise when it is appropriate and welcomed. This stage of awakening is marked by the cultivation of patience and discernment. You come to recognize that the world cannot be forced to see what it avoids, and that the true power of perception lies not in external influence, but in the integrity of your own consciousness. By embracing this understanding, you navigate the complexities of reality with wisdom, allowing your awareness to inform your actions without being consumed by the resistance or unconsciousness of the crowd. As your clarity deepens, you begin to feel the emotional weight of knowing more than the crowd around you. It is not a burden in the conventional sense, but a subtle, persistent presence that shapes your interactions and your inner life. You notice how easily others can become defensive or dismissive when faced with truths they prefer to ignore, and you recognize the psychological mechanisms that maintain their comfort at the cost of authenticity. This awareness brings both insight and responsibility, understanding the depth of human avoidance while maintaining your own centeredness. At times, it feels isolating. Conversations that once felt natural now appear strained, as if you are speaking a different language than everyone else. Even familiar faces, people you have known for years, can seem distant when their perception is tethered to denial or collective illusions. Yet in this solitude, there is also clarity. You learn to differentiate between genuine engagement and superficial interaction. You begin to recognize which relationships nurture awareness and which merely reinforce unconscious patterns. Your presence alone, calm and perceptive, can act as a mirror, reflecting truths that others are not yet ready to face. This stage of awakening also amplifies emotional sensitivity. You feel the subtle currents of others' unspoken thoughts and suppressed feelings, and it can be exhausting. You start noticing the silent agreements to avoid discomfort, the subtle manipulations, the avoidance of accountability. Your perception allows you to see the hidden motivations, the shadows beneath social rituals, and the narratives people use to protect themselves from reality. It is as if you are navigating a parallel world layered beneath the apparent one, a landscape of unseen dynamics and invisible truths. And here is where I want you to reflect. Have you experienced the subtle weight of knowing more than those around you? Can you feel the tension that arises when your presence illuminates what others would rather avoid? Share your experience in the comments below. Your insight not only strengthens your own understanding, but also helps others recognize similar patterns in their journey. What surprised you most about your awakening? Reflect, write, and engage with this community of awareness, because the conversation itself becomes part of the growth process. As you navigate the heightened awareness that comes from seeing what others avoid, the process of spiritual maturation begins to unfold naturally. You start to understand that awareness alone is not enough. It must be integrated, refined, and balanced with discernment. Confronting hidden truths about human behavior and societal patterns is both liberating and challenging. It reveals the illusions that govern most lives and clarifies the difference between external performance and authentic being. The journey toward maturity is subtle, often invisible, yet it shapes the way you perceive reality at every level. This stage brings profound insight into the dynamics of consciousness itself. You notice how collective denial is reinforced by habitual behavior, cultural expectations, and shared fears. You observe the ways in which people unconsciously protect themselves from confronting uncomfortable realities, and you recognize the invisible currents that influence thought, emotion, and action. The awakened mind begins to navigate these currents with precision, understanding when to engage, when to observe, and when to remain silent. Every decision is informed by clarity rather than expectation, and each interaction becomes an exercise in conscious presence. With this clarity comes emotional resilience. You learn to observe the distortions and defenses of others without absorbing their tension or losing your own equilibrium. The capacity to remain centered while perceiving layers of unconsciousness around you is a skill that develops over time, shaped by experience and reflection. You start noticing the subtle interplay between personal perception and collective illusion, understanding that the world does not need your approval nor your attempts to force change. Instead, your maturity allows you to act from alignment, preserving energy and maintaining integrity without being consumed by the need to correct or awaken others prematurely. As this process continues, you realize that spiritual growth is not a linear path. It is iterative, dynamic, and constantly responsive to the environment. Awareness and insight must be tempered by patience and compassion, both for yourself and for those who remain immersed in collective illusion. You come to see that your role is not to awaken the world, but to embody clarity in your own life, creating a space in which truth can be witnessed without coercion. This stage is less about action in the external sense, and more about the cultivation of inner equilibrium, the ability to remain present, and the discernment to engage consciously, always aware of the unseen forces shaping reality around you. At this stage, the awakened mind begins to fully understand the responsibility of perception. You realize that clarity brings insight, but insight is not obligation. The truth you see is not meant to be imposed on those who are not ready to perceive it, and every attempt to force awareness can create resistance, misunderstanding, or conflict. The deeper understanding is that your role is not to control or correct, but to navigate reality with presence, integrity, and conscious discretion. Observing without interfering becomes a core principle of maintaining both clarity and balance. You begin to recognize the subtle ways in which others project their fears, insecurities, and unexamined beliefs onto those who see more clearly. This projection can create tension, guilt, or pressure, but your maturation allows you to observe these dynamics without internalizing them. You learn to differentiate between what belongs to you and what belongs to the collective consciousness, maintaining boundaries while remaining empathetic. Awareness becomes a skill of balance, a delicate dance between perception, engagement, and detachment, where your energy is preserved and your clarity sharpened. This stage also illuminates the limits of influence. You understand that consciousness develops at its own pace, and that forcing awakening in others is futile. Instead, you cultivate patience, recognizing that your presence alone can serve as a subtle guide or a mirror for those who are ready. The insight gained from seeing beyond collective illusion informs your actions, words, and choices, but always tempered by discernment. You act from alignment with truth rather than expectation, and you recognize the power of stillness, observation, and restraint as much as action. The awakened mind begins to navigate reality with a nuanced understanding of human behavior, social patterns, and the unconscious agreements that shape collective life. You see that the world does not need your correction. It needs your clarity, your presence, and your ability to embody awareness without judgment or force. This stage strengthens inner sovereignty, allowing you to operate fully within your own consciousness, while remaining responsive and compassionate to the unfolding dynamics around you. The lessons here are profound. Mastery is not in changing others, but in maintaining clarity, integrity, and conscious engagement without being consumed by the unconsciousness of the world. At this final stage, the awakened individual integrates all the insights gathered throughout the journey. You understand that living in clarity does not require constant explanation, correction, or intervention. The world around you may still operate in collective illusion, but your perception remains grounded, stable, and unshaken. You move through life with conscious presence, observing patterns without being entangled, engaging where necessary and holding space for truth without demanding recognition or change. The balance you cultivate is the hallmark of mature awareness. This integration allows you to act from alignment, choosing relationships, actions, and spaces that resonate with authenticity. You no longer feel compelled to awaken the world, knowing that consciousness unfolds in its own time. You embody the principle that influence comes, not from force but from presence. By living authentically, By maintaining clarity while allowing others to process reality at their own pace, you create a subtle ripple effect that may inspire awakening when conditions are right. You realize that your energy is finite, your awareness precious, and your clarity is a tool, not a weapon. And here is the essence of the final stage. You are not alone. Even in a world that prefers sleep, there are others who perceive, who feel, who awaken. Connecting with these individuals allows you to expand, share perspectives, and find resonance without compromise. You become a border dweller, someone who navigates both realms, awake and asleep, with grace, integrity, and discernment. Your life becomes an example of conscious living, not through preaching or forcing, but through the quiet power of authenticity. If you have followed this journey to the end, take a moment to reflect and engage. Subscribe to the channel to continue exploring these truths and to remain connected to a community of awakened individuals. Leave a comment below with the phrase, "This message was for me," if you resonated with this path, sharing your thoughts or experiences about seeing what the crowd avoids. And don't forget to like this video, because the simple act of acknowledgement helps deepen awareness and encourages more conversations like this. There is a video here next that complements these insights. Click and continue the journey, exploring even deeper layers of awakening and conscious presence.